those problems? Well, I want to, as a man once said, tell you a story. And it's about a guy called Harry. Now, this was written in 2014. So when I say Harry's story begins 20 years ago, that's because I wrote this originally in 2014 and Harry's story began in 1994. Now, I could have brought all these numbers way up to date, but actually then the numbers you're going to see look even more impressive. So I've kept the original story here. Now, 1994 didn't represent an obviously cheap as chips time to be buying into the stock market, but Harry had had a £100,000 inheritance, and he basically wanted to get on with it, investing it. He was a busy man, and it was burning a hole in his pocket. And Harry perhaps was like many of you listening in today. He knew a little bit about investing through investing smaller sums. And he was fascinated by the whole subject and read around it an awful lot. And at the time, as they are today, still George Soros and Warren Buffett were living legends. And he also read some intriguing books on investment history. And one book which was particularly interesting, but also totally uncompromising, was this one. I don't know how many of you have read this. It first came out in 1972, I think. And it's called A Random Walk Down Wall Street by a guy called Burton Malkiel. Now, the message of the book was absolutely clear. And what Malkiel said was, there's no point buying anything other than index tracking funds or passive funds, mostly represented in ETFs today, because actively managed funds are so poor and the few good ones are really inconsistent. Now, instinctively to Harry, this didn't feel quite right. He'd tinkered with small sums, particularly in individual shares, usually following other people's tips. And that had been fascinating, but on the whole, it wasn't terribly profitable. And I say, does that ring any bells? It was certainly my early experience investing too. But clearly there were investors who had global reputations who were doing extremely well, and just touched on Soros and Warren Buffett. And that was totally in conflict with what Malkiel was saying, because if what Malkiel was saying was correct, people like Soros and Buffett couldn't exist. So he put this is Harry now. Harry put Buffett and Soros next to each other to try and compare what they were doing and see perhaps what one of them was doing, which he could adopt. And on the one hand, we had Buffett, who does what's called value investing, and he would do in-depth analysis of companies, a huge amount of number crunching, required a lot of knowledge. And he would identify companies which were not just cheap, but unjustifiably cheap. Now, the only problem with this, a really practical problem for most people, is that you've absolutely no idea when the market will also recognize the value that you've uncovered. So considerable patience is required. In contrast, let's look at George Soros. Now, Soros did what's called momentum investing, and at its simplest, it meant buying what's going up today, what's going up most today, I should say, on the assumption that it will keep going up tomorrow by more than everyone else. And when I say today and tomorrow, obviously that's I don't mean that literally. So it was about buying winners. And there was a volume of research that showed this worked, but only over certain timescales. And that research, some of it went back to the 1930s. And what Soros also said was, in this context, the more disciplined you can get in doing this, the better you're going to do at it. Now, the best analogy, I think, on what Soros was doing was, imagine you're in the Grand National and you're on a horse, you're a jockey on a horse, and halfway round it runs out of puff, and you're allowed to magically jump over onto the freshest horse. It's a bit like that with momentum investing. And imagine that jockey, he's going to win, isn't he? He can keep jumping off the horse running out of puff and getting onto the one that still has some puff to get him round. Well, Harry instinctively liked what Soros was doing. It seemed straightforward too. But he figured that rather than buying individual stocks, which was typically what Soros was doing, why not buy funds? Because the fund managers were already doing all of that hard work analysing individual stocks. Now, he did accept that few fund managers were consistently successful over longer periods. That was what Malkiel said, and it's also a statistical fact, and it's one we've seen ourselves. But a good number of those funds were successful over shorter periods of time. And even that was accepted by Malkiel. So why not apply momentum strategy to buying funds? So it was a eureka moment for Harry, and so this was his plan. He wanted to stick to funds invested in the UK stock market. So in July 1994, he did this. He bought the best UK growth funds of the last 6 months. And then what he planned to do was sell those 6 months later, and then buy the top performing funds of the next most recent 6 months, and so on and so on. And he'd repeat that process every 6 months. And these are the funds he actually bought in the first 18 months. Some of those companies still around. Some of you may have been in and out of those funds over the years. So they were bought at the beginning of 6 months, sold at the end, and then the next lot were bought. So hopefully that's very clear. Now, this is his journey. You know, this was not necessarily an easy time to invest, and I think this is clearly illustrated here. In 1997, so he bought in 94, by 97 there was an economic crisis in Asia, and a more serious repeat of that in the following year. There was a Russian financial crisis, the collapse of the first hedge fund to collapse in LTCM, long-term capital management. And the next 3 years were even more crazy as the tech bubble gathered pace, dragged all the markets up with it. And the UK stock market hit a peak at the end of December in 1999. And when I originally wrote this story in 2014, that peak of 1999 had still not been breached. Then it all came tumbling down. The tech bubble burst and the market fell 48%. And it took 3 years for that correction or crash or whatever to take place. But luckily, Harry was really busy day to day, and he didn't panic, didn't have time to panic. He didn't get distracted. He just kept applying his process, buying at the beginning of 6 months, selling at the end of 6 months, and so on and so on and so on. And by 2003, a new market upswing began. And it was a very profitable 5 years to boot. And the momentum strategy particularly was absolutely superb at keeping him in the best funds during that period. And then in 2008, it all came tumbling down again. Lehman's went bust. So, you know, this was a really, really tough time to be investing from 94 to 2008. And yet by Feb 2014, you know, Harry's original £100,000 had grown to over 1.1 million, as you see here in brackets. It went up by just over 1,000%. And that's 3 times more growth than the index. And compared to an average UK growth fund, he made an extra £808,446. And here's a chart just illustrating that to you. It's all different numbers. But you know, unless you had the discipline and honesty of Harry, though, that 808,446 was lost to you. And in fact, the vast majority of investors would have lost out on that 808,000. And we know that. We know that because 92% of funds are mediocre at best. And that's our own research, where 92% of funds cannot beat a very basic benchmark. And when you go onto our site, you can see that research there. I think that's freely available on there. And then year after year, individual investors consistently generate substantially less than the stock market. And that's shown by the Dalbar report, which is produced every single year in the United States. And that individual investors do consistently buy high and sell low was also reconfirmed in the Credit Suisse yearbook in 2014. Investors, and not just retail investors, consistently miss out on significant profits. And that's not just because those funds are so poor, it's also because their investing technique is so poor. Nonetheless, you know, Harry had stumbled across something very, very important, and it was selecting funds using a momentum approach. And that's what underpinned FundExpert when it was set up, and it's encapsulated in what we call our dynamic fund ratings, which basically highlight the top performing funds of the prior 6 months, sector by sector.